or a lot of money in either having the interior fences put up or maybe doing the step-in post.
Virtual fencing, it's a topic that spurs intrigue for a lot of us, but often from a distance, whether it's the newness of the technology or the cost to implement. Today, Matt Vermeersch with No Fence joins us as we explore the technology as a whole. Additionally, we'll hear from Idaho rancher Tyson Coles with his perspective as a user.
And the virtual fencing has allowed me to keep those animals contained in a smaller paddock, move them more frequently, let the crop regrow, reestablish before I ever got back to them.
So what are the factors to contemplate when considering an investment in virtual fencing? It's truly an emerging technology that has very practical usefulness to a rancher. And are we at that point where the ends justify the means? That's on today's episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. Hi again, everyone, and welcome to the Working Ranch Radio Show. Justin Mills here with you, your host, and glad to have you tuned in and joining us on today's program. Now, did you catch last week's show? It was episode 209, entitled Skills Needed for Today's Ranch Manager, a discussion I had a while back with Rick Machen out of the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management. Really a great show with some dynamic conversation in there for all folks, whether it's those looking at ranch management, those currently in ranch management positions, or even the generation that's going to be seeing that next generation and help foster them in. I think you'll find last week's show extremely useful. And along those same lines, I got a note here from the captain, Tim O'Byrne. He added to that. He said, I think should be that ranch managers know how to deal with public lands and have to have acute ability to deal with government agencies. He added that they need to know the law, their rights, and what some nefarious folks are willing to do to upend the ranch's grazing plans. So some advice there from the captain on that. A great show last week. You can check it out by going to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com, or if you have your own preferred site, check it out as well. I want to remind you later on in the show here today, we're going to be also talking about deworming. It is that time of the year where you need to be thinking about good parasite control and how you can manage that. So be sure to tune in later on in the show for that. And of course, meteorologist Don Day will be in to talk about our long-range weather forecast. Yeah, it looks like in about a week, we're going to start to see some weather back in the across the country. So be sure to tune in, and we'll be talking about our long-range weather later on in the program. Well, as we turn towards our subject at hand here today, it's definitely been something that I've been intrigued with. In fact, it was a few years ago I did a show on virtual fencing, and yet I also know with it being technology, and technology just continues to improve and get better and better, I think it warrants yet another show to get in and see where things are at here yet today, because I know it's definitely something that people are aware of. Maybe you don't know the full details of some of it, and I hope to uncover some of that here today. But nevertheless, we're going to be getting two perspectives here today. Matt Vermeersch is going to be joining me. He's a sales specialist out of southwestern Iowa with the No Fence company. That's one of the brands and makers of virtual fencing. And Tyson Coles, who's the owner of Coles Family Farm near Idaho Falls, Idaho, will also be joining us, and he'll be representing somebody that's actually using it. So with that, guys, glad to have you here on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Thanks, Justin. Glad to be here.
Yeah.
So when we look at this technology as a whole, and I want to start there today because I know, and as we were talking before we went on air, I realize there's 5 or so manufacturers of virtual type fencing in the industry here today. There's maybe a couple others that are looking on the outside, maybe coming in at some point down the road. At the same time, Matt, I'm going to go to you first on this. When we look at virtual fencing as a whole, I know, for example, No Fence was one of the early founders of this whole concept and this whole technology. But essentially, what is the issue, or what is the problem that we see virtual fencing being able to solve?
Yeah, there's a couple of big priorities I would say virtual fencing as a whole is trying to accomplish. The first one, getting animals back out on the land, making it easier for ranchers to have the animals on the land. And with that comes the rotations that are much easier, as well as the ability to improve soil health through the rotational grazing. And then another big thing I would say is the amount of time saved. Ranchers who already are rotating, they're spending a lot of time or a lot of money in either having the interior fences put up or maybe doing the step-in post with poly wire reels, and spend a lot of time doing that. And so virtual fencing really allows ranchers and farmers to spend a lot more time doing the high value activities as opposed to low value activities like that.
Mm-hmm. I think the first time I did a show on virtual fencing here on the Working Ranch Radio Show was, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago. How fast is this technology changing?
Pretty quickly. We started out with the basic of just the fencing aspect of things, but the more we move forward in this, looking more towards things like animal health, what kind of data can we collect? What kind of features can we include with technology and the data we're already collecting? How can we make better information data to give to farmers for their own operations?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point that you brought up, because as we talked about how fast it's evolving, maybe that brings up another point too, Matt, and this is within your company of No Fence, where are you guys thinking this is going?
Right now, the biggest thing we're looking at is just expanding in the U.S. But we are talking about the animal health side of things. What kind of features are in there? Such as like detecting heat. Are there things like that we can bring into it, and maybe combine different platforms into one.
Mm-hmm. So as this has expanded, and you said one of your biggest goals right now is to continue to see expansion in the country here with that. From a mental standpoint for producers, what's maybe it's more than one thing, but what is something that from a philosophical standpoint that in talking with producers that maybe would be a change in how they need to view things if they're going to understand how this could be applicable and usable in their operation?
I would say for me personally, as not just a member of the company, but someone who's also going to be using this technology soon. I have 2 young kids myself, and I spend a lot of time right now putting polywire in, rotating my cattle, and that's time away from my kids. I look at it, biggest thing to me right now, honestly, is my family life. I have a 2-week-old child, a 2.5-year-old, and a 3.5-year-old at home, and I want to spend as much time with them as possible. So the more time that I can spend at home, wrangling up the kids instead of the cows, that makes me happy.
Mm-hmm. Tyson, I'll have you answer that question as well, because you as a producer yourself, a user of the product, of a virtual fencing product, what was pushing you that direction?
Time management. Yeah, that was a big one for me. Our operation, we run about 640 irrigated acres of cropland and an extra 100 acres of rangeland pasture. But I've been integrating the cattle more and more onto the cropland acres through cover cropping and rotational grazing. And so I started out initially, yes, having electric fence strung out and just the time of dropping wires so pivots can go around, moving cattle around, stringing wires up, keeping them. It just took a little bit of time when I could have been doing other stuff, getting crops in the ground or, other big things that I need to get done on the farm. So time management was a big thing for you, looking towards different technologies of what can more efficient operation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't have any hired hands. It's me and my wife, and my kids are getting a little older now. My oldest son's 12 and a couple other kids, a daughter older. So they're getting into it, but they're a younger family also.
Mm-hmm.
I would say there's many different reasons for anyone to be able to be interested in this technology. There's the time management thing. There's maybe people who aren't rotating that want to rotate. Maybe the people that are rotating, moving on every couple of days, once a week. Maybe they want to push that to once every day, once every 2 days. The soil health aspect of things, lengthening their grazing season, cost savings. Everyone has a different reason. It all depends on the context that they come from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say every one of those points came into play on my operation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right, guys, let's take a break here. And I know we haven't really talked nitty-gritty details of virtual fencing, and we'll do that when we come back here after the break. Hey, the latest issue of Working Ranch Magazine is out. It is the April-May issue. And if you are a regular subscriber, you probably have already seen it show up in the mailbox. This latest front cover, you can identify it by seeing a guy in a rope and a Brandon pin with some good-looking Red Angus calves in there, along with a couple other looks like Red Angus cross calves as well. But check it out. In fact, I thought it was interesting, Matt, as you are joining us here from Iowa here today, there is an article on page 62 of the Iowa Beef Industry Council. Check it out, by Casey Randy Atkinson on that article, along with a lot of great stories, features, articles, very useful for all of us here in the ranching industry. Check out the latest issue of Working Ranch Magazine. If you don't have a subscription, you can easily get one started by going to workingranchmag.com, or you can stop by your local Tractor Supply store and pick up the latest issue as well. Well, as we get back into our topic here today, we're talking virtual fencing here, and joining me on the program is Matt Vermeersch, who is a sales specialist with No Fence, and Tyson Coles, who's the owner of Coles Family Farm out of Idaho Falls, Idaho. And we've got Matt representing, the company as No Fence, and then Tyson as a user in this. So I'm having both of these guys on here to talk, namely, just about how virtual fencing can be used in an operation. In the last segment, sort of setting the stage up of why and sort of the philosophy of where this came about and moving towards. Guys, I want to move now into more of the physical aspects, the component, the kind of and Tyson, I think you'll probably come into this. I know Matt as well, but just really the physical components of this as far as getting it set up and user interface. I know we're going to be specifically probably somewhat talking more about your product, No Fence, but if you also at the same time talk generically in a way too about just virtual fencing as a whole, from a physical element of what I would see as a rancher. What am I going to see? What would I be using, the platform, how I would be integrating that in what we're doing? So maybe Matt, I'll start with you, and then Tyson, you can kind of throw in here when we go back and forth. So Matt, I want to start with you on this, and just from a standpoint of, physically, I think everybody knows, it's a collar, it's some sort of element around there, but we do have some variations in the industry between what powers the collars, whether they're battery operated, solar operated, things like that. Talk about that component that we see in our industry here today.
Yeah. So like you mentioned, our product is a collar, and we offer both a collar for cattle as well as a separate collar for sheep and goats. But so I'll talk specifically about the cattle collar. So that weighs about 3 pounds. It hangs below cattle's neck, just like a cowbell would. And inside of that collar is a lithium-ion rechargeable battery, and there's solar panels on the side to charge it. Every customer kind of has a different battery life that they're experiencing. It kind of depends on how much they're rotating, how frequently the animals are interacting with the border, as well as how much access to sun do they have. And I know Tyson, he's had quite a long battery life, but we generally recommend that those batteries are going to last anywhere from 9 to 12 months, depending on the variables I just mentioned. Outside of the collars, for us specifically, all we have is either a tablet or a phone. We are strictly app powered. So you do all of your animal movements through the app on one of those devices. And that's really all you're going to see. For other companies, some of them do require base stations and are more desktop powered, where you do things from your computer. But us specifically are no base stations, which does require an element of cell service on your farm.
Mm-hmm. Tyson, go ahead. Maybe from a user perspective, we're very similar. Like Matt had said, a lot of the products in the industry are a collar-based product that hangs around the neck of the animal. But from your perspective, how is that working? How does the animals integrate with that in their environment?
Yeah, so they are collars hanging around the neck. The first initial install of the collars, or hanging the collars around the cow's neck, it took them a couple hours to get used to. They weren't sure. My cows didn't have chains or bells or anything around their neck, so they were a little excitable when they had the collars on for the first time, but they get used to them just fine. Like Matt said, it's about 3 pounds for a big animal like that. That's not too much weight to carry around. And they really got used to them fairly quickly. And we were able to kind of fit. No Fence had put out some training videos on YouTube prior to starting the pilot program that I was in, testing them with them here in the U.S. market. And so I tried to follow their fitment guidelines when putting the collars on the cows, leaving enough space below the neck so they didn't get too tight, but not loose enough that they would slip off the cows' heads. And I've had great battery life. Here in Idaho in the mountains, we get a fair amount of sun in the summer and even in the wintertime. And we were able to keep battery in the collars for quite a long time.
So, Matt, I want to go to you on this next question, and that is this. You had talked about some of the different technologies. Some require a base station, others don't require a base station. What's that difference in the industry? I mean, I think I know the answer, but maybe have you explain that.
Ultimately, it's probably where the technology was developed and how much cell coverage is in that area. Some companies are well prepared for customers who do not have cell service, and that's where a base station could come in really handy because it can bring that coverage for the product to the farm. Whereas someone like us, we do require an element of cell service in your area. So, that kind of eliminates maybe some of the mountainous areas as well as, just the really rural areas that maybe don't have great cell coverage.
Mm-hmm. So what are sort of the factors that, that a guy would be looking at for making a decision on if they were looking at this that you feel would be, let's kind of go through this check mark of things. And if this kind of fits, then this would fit to look at a virtual fence product.
Yeah. So the first thing I always think about is whatever property you're leasing, and the area that it's in. So virtual fencing is not a replacement for perimeter fencing. But that being said, everyone lives in a different area. Like me and myself, I live up against the county highway. So I don't want my cattle to be strictly on a virtual fence just in case they do happen to escape. But there are people that live in very rural parts of my county that, they'll just keep their cows on a single hot wire all winter long on corn stalks. So, that's a good replacement for that. I think about maybe people who are renting pasture land and the fences aren't very good. Instead of spending money to update those fences on the property that either you're going to have a lot of labor taken off if you lose that lease, maybe you spend that money and put it towards virtual fencing instead. Those are the two things I always like to talk about up front.
Okay. Tyson, I'm going to ask you this question from just as a rancher to another rancher here. Okay. Walk me through how you've seen it work, how it's working.
Yeah. So starting out, I have 2 3-tower pivots behind my house on an 80-acre farm. And I would run it's a cow-calf herd. I would run about 70 mothers with calves on them. I would just string out a wire from east to west, north to south from my pivot point. Then I would group that set of 70 cows on 8 acres on 1 quarter for a little bit of time, day, 2 days, and then rotate them around those 2 pivots. It'd be about 2 weeks. Time I threw some other pasture into that rotation before I came back to any specific piece of ground. The last couple of years using the virtual fencing, I would shrink those perimeters from about 8 acres down to 2 acres, and I would rotate every 12 hours. So last year, I would keep the herd contained in about 2 acres. I'd move their virtual boundary at 6 a.m., let them graze that day, move it again at 6 p.m., and rotate in a circular pattern all the way around the pivot. And that way I was able to still keep like a 2-week rotation. It was about 16 days is how I divided the pivot before the cows got back into any specific plot of ground. And I'm grazing cover crops throughout the whole grazing. This is on cropland. I was looking at different avenues for revenue generation with commodity prices being lower the last 7 years. And so cattle, I'd already had them on my operation. That was the integration part to get me going. And the virtual fencing has allowed me to keep those animals contained in a smaller paddock, move them more frequently, let the crop regrow, reestablish. Before I ever got back to them, the pivot, the irrigation part of it, here in Idaho, we're a dry climate. We get about 12 inch a year. And so irrigation, one way or another, is a necessity. And flood irrigated ground, which I didn't feel would keep up with the cattle grazing the crop down just because of water rotations and the time it takes to get across the ground. So the center pivot irrigation really helped out in that aspect as well. And so I was able to just keep the pivot going around either right ahead of the cows or right behind the cows, keep the crop watered, keep it growing up, and really have increased my carrying capacity on that.
Okay. Did you ever have any issues with cows getting out of that, your geofence that you'd kind of put in there, anything like that had ever happened?
No, not really. There's been a few of the Springer heifers or younger bulls that while they were being trained on the system, they're learning it right along there with the other cows that are already well versed in how the system works and the audible tones and the pulses. And so they would maybe get a pulse once in a while. I'd get an alert on my phone if they escaped, went outside the boundary, because it is a pretty small perimeter. and they want to just move and graze. But overall, within 10 minutes, they were right back with the herd, right back inside the virtual boundary. And it really, really wasn't that big of an issue. I would say, from a containment standpoint, I've had young bulls that they're going to walk through whatever fence is in front of them. They just do that. And with the virtual fencing collars, they may get an electric pulse every other time they get an audible tone, but I have never had one really escape that boundary. They always stay right there inside. So it's been really good that way.
That's good. Okay, Tyson, you mentioned a couple times you talked about some training and some training videos. Either one, Matt or Tyson, either one of you want to answer this. How are we training? What's the process in training these animals?
Okay, so what I saw in their training videos on YouTube that No Fence put out, and what I did on my operation is they recommend having a perimeter wire on 3 sides of the animals, and then one virtual perimeter to interact with, to get accustomed to when the audible tones come, what the consequences are going to be when they don't adhere to that audible tone, and then still have just the other physical fence that they're used to seeing. And they recommended about a week worth of training. I gave my herd initially about 3 weeks, just due to the timing of when I got the collars, got them put on the cows, was ready to graze. It was in the fall, so I was needing a little extra time to get some cover crops grown up before I grazed them anyways. So I just wanted to make sure they were good and comfortable with the way the system worked. And so that typically was how it did. I gave them a physical fence on 3 sides and just let them interact with that one virtual boundary, let them get familiar with it. And then I turned them out, and they did just fine. I rotated for, it would have been a week on those couple of pivots just in the fall, kind of finishing one last grazing pass before winter set in. And I had sucked in all my physical wire already from that year grazing before the virtual fencing, and just set up my virtual boundary the same as I had with physical wire. And the cows pretty well just stayed right where my virtual boundary was established. Mm-hmm.
Well, guys, let's take a break here as we'll continue one more segment talking about virtual fence. And I know for those of you listening, or for anybody that's been thinking about virtual fence, there's probably one question that's circling around and bouncing around in your head. I think I know what that is. And if you want to find out what that question is, we'll get to it after this. Okay, let's move on to the next subject. And Matt, I'm going to probably go at you with this one. And this is, you can't talk to a rancher or farmer without him asking the next question. What do you think it's going to be, Matt?
Cost.
There you go. All right. So let's talk about that, because I mean, when I look at it, frankly, I mean, that's, and I know you're nodding your head at the same time. And Tyson, you kind of had a smirk on your face when he said that, but that definitely has to be an issue that you talk about quite a bit about. And so where are we at with that? Where's it going?
Yeah. So I'll talk specifically about the cost for our cattle collar. To purchase the collar, it is a collar that you own. It is $289 per collar. And at the time of purchase, we do have a subscription charge that we continually charge. But at the time of purchase, you do pay for the first 12 months of subscription up front, which is $56. If you are above 50 head or 50 collars, there is a discount on that of about 30% for the subscription cost. So your upfront cost is $345. You will not receive another bill for any subscription until year 2. Years 2 and on, there's a couple different options, but the most common one is a pay-as-you-go method, where you pay $6.50 per collar per month, and it's only charged in the months that you use it. So if you remove the batteries from the collars, the battery or the collars are shown as inactive, and you are not charged when the collars are not in use. Mm-hmm. And just for our product specifically, we do have a 5-year warranty. And so if you were to spread that cost out over 5 years, it's about $10 per collar per month over that 5 years.
Mm-hmm. And I don't expect you, Matt, to know everything about some of the other products in the industry, but there are some big pricing differentiations between the different products that are out there. And I realize that some of that's based upon whether or not those are, like in your guys' case, does not require a base station or things like that. But just, can you talk a little on just pricing and things to be aware of when people are looking at the different products in the industry? Or Tyson, I guess if you know an answer to that question, or just some thoughts in that, along that realm of that conversation.
For me, I would say in general, we're all fairly competitive pricing wise. I know there are some companies where maybe the cost of the collar is just quite a bit less, but you have to pay for base stations to be installed on your property, which is a higher price, than something, obviously, because we don't have a base station. But I mean, I think it was like around, if you had like 60 head or 80 head, I mean, they were all for the most part within the same ballpark.
Okay. Now, Tyson, I'm going to ask you this. You justifying the cost with what you're doing?
Yeah. So when I was looking at this, I've got 135 acres that I rent from a grower, and the fences were kind of torn down. That scenario of, do I install physical fence, perimeter fence? Do I look at virtual fencing so I can graze those acres? And initially, fencing that chunk of ground, just perimeter barbed wire, would cost about $35,000. And the virtual fencing collars for 100 head, just round numbers, would be about $42,000. So it was a little more upfront for the virtual fencing collars. But I have an additional 400 acres of dry land that I usually never touch and never graze. And some of that's got water next to it, some of it doesn't, but there's no fencing anywhere. So in that scenario, I do run 20 pair up there on river bottom and rangeland pasture. And this year I was able to open up an extra 100 acres that I had planted cover crops in, and I extended my grazing season for a month. And so that this year, in the amount of feed, with the current hay prices, that saved me about $3,500. And then throughout the course of the winter time, what I found that I could do is, rather than taking feed out to them every day, I take my feed out a week at a time. So I start the tractor up on Saturday. My kids are home. They can help take the baling twine off the bells. I can spread the bells out a little bit in rows using the GPS on my tractor, mark a flag as to where that row is on my No Fence app. And then I have a reference point that I can just move my virtual boundary every day at feeding time, let the cows eat, and the hay's ready for the next day. I don't have to go fire the tractor up, which is good when it's negative 20 outside. The wear and tear on the tractors, I went from an hour a day minimum, so 7 days a week, to about 3 hours a week, hours on the tractor. So if guys are leasing tractors, 4 hours savings a week on the hour on the tachometer, there's money on the lease. They can put it towards, actual farm ground operations or different operations that way. So they're definitely, if you put pencil to it, there's definitely economic returns, just finding different ways to utilize the technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Matt, I'm going to ask you this question because it's more about the future of this. And when I hear, and Tyson did a great job of explaining kind of the economics of it and laying it out from a perspective of how this can pencil over a course of time. And for outfits that are running maybe a couple thousand head of yearlings, or 5,000 head of yearlings on some big open country, are we going to get to a point that it's economical for them?
I think so, honestly. I mean, just think about the cost of your televisions over the last 30 years, how much the price has decreased on that. So the cost of electronics are continuously going down. As we continue to improve technology, it just keeps getting cheaper. So I just see virtual fencing becoming more affordable. And I mean, just for us specifically, I mean, we had about 15% price decline at the end of 24. Yeah. So,
because that's where, these big, vast open areas where they can set a set of cows into these big range permits, and to be able to manipulate those cattle into those areas. I think that's where I see this being an exciting future.
And a good point to the GPS positioning on that. You already know where the cattle are anyways. I mean, so even if one happened to escape through that boundary or whatever, right where she's at. You can go get her, drive her back in, whatever. But it really can save a lot of time that way.
Mm-hmm. To both of you, real quick, as we kind of close out our conversation here today, and maybe we just kind of brush that just a little bit in my, as I was talking about some of these large range permits and operators that run in those kind of environments. And Matt, I'll ask you this first. Tyson, I'll ask you the same thing. What excites you the most about the future of virtual fencing?
I just think what excites me the most on a personal level is getting more animals out on the land and making life easier. Whether you're out on a lease and you're spending weeks at a time rounding up your cattle, like Tyson talked about. You have a GPS position and it just saves you a lot of time because you know where your animals are at. I talked to a farmer in Idaho that he gets paid. He has sheep and he gets paid if he can prove that maybe there's a wolf, some kind of predator kill. And so we have a feature through our app that you can notify within 4 hours if an animal has not moved. And so if you can find a kill site within 4 hours or after 4 hours after it's happened, you can bring out and prove that it's a predator kill pretty quickly and get paid for it. So, there's all different avenues of just making life better, simpler, and easier.
Yeah. Tyson, you're in about the 0.1% of the country that's using it. Really, when I look at it. So, yeah. I mean, you talked about how you're able to justify it from a cost standpoint, but as you look ahead, what do you see?
I've been trying to become a regenerative farm for about the last 5 years, and I would say I'm kind of following regenerative practices, and I am a regenerative farm. And from the soil health standpoint and longevity of our farm ground that is continuing to diminish across the country, keeping that soil healthy and viable to grow crops and good food products for our population. I think the technology just helps people to be able to integrate cattle and sheep, goats, other livestock, all ruminants back onto their operations, because there's a lot of operations, within the farming sector that have either gone one way or the other. They're either a cattle operation or they're a cropping operation. They're not really mixed entities. So being able to take ground that hasn't had fence on it for 30, 40, 80 years, get cattle, get sheep, get goats back on that farm ground, getting the biology back in the soil, helping rebuild that soil profile, definitely opens up opportunities for all growers kind of throughout the country.
Mm-hmm. Tyson, not to jump off on a sidetrack here real quick, but it's something that you just said there that brought to mind this. And in fact, I think it was a week or so ago, my nephew that works for me, Tristan, and I were just sitting down and we were looking at, well, what if we weren't running cows? What other species of animal could we be running? And some of our limitations to why we could or could not do things, number one was fence. Actually, his predator was close. Predator, and I'm talking more like a sheep or a goat or something like that. But it was fence and predation were the two things that were an issue with why we could not change. And when I look at it, if you really could change, you would, because A, from a profitability standpoint, and two, from a soil standpoint. Am I far off on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on. I mean, like Matt said, the predation side, even if there are animals there, I mean, you don't want to lose any of your livestock, but fairly quickly if something happens. That's a good thing about this versus, just one of those forest contracts. You're running 300, 400 head of cattle up in the hills. You may be missing 50 in the fall when you go to gather them up. You don't have a clue where they went, what happened. Some you may find, some you may never find. So there's peace of mind in knowing that, you're going to be able to have your livestock herd there and access to them, know where they're at all times. And then the fencing side of it, I've done both ways on my operations. I've opened up, that dry land ground. It was next to perimeter fencing that I used for the regular pasture, but the cropland didn't have anything around it. So it was just nothing but virtual fencing that those cows went out on, and they stayed contained just fine. I've never had in that scenario over the last 3 years, I've used it 4 or 5 times where the virtual fencing is their sole fence, and the cows always stay right where they're at. They've never gone off and wandered then anywhere that was going to cause any issues. So the fencing side of it, all those different scenarios, that's one thing that operations, just need to look at. I've talked 3 or 4 times to some guys in Western Idaho this week that are looking into virtual fencing, and they have those exact questions that we talked about earlier. What's the battery life? How well does it contain the animals? How accurate is the GPS positioning on it? And is there going to be a payback on this scenario versus physical fencing? So each operation is different, but if you just write down, if thens, what if not, what's the pros, what's the cons? I think there's definitely room to grow this whole market.
Yeah, you bet. Well, guys, thanks so much. Matt, some final comments from you. Anything else you want to add before we head out here today?
I would just say for those that are interested and those that work with the NRCS on their farms, states are starting to cost share virtual fencing. So I would reach out to your local office and spread the word, so to say, see if you can take advantage of some of that funding that is out there. Like me in Iowa specifically, we have it available in our state, and it's a new practice for 2025. But going forward, I see more states getting involved with that through the EQIP program. So but take a look through there. And then if interested in No Fence specifically, you can find us at No Fence, so NOFENCE.co/US.
You bet. Okay. Well, guys, Matt, Tyson, thanks for joining us here on the program today.
Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Justin.
You bet. And again, a thank you to our guests joining us here today, Matt Vermeersch with No Fence and Tyson Coles, owner of Coles Family Farm out of Idaho Falls. Appreciate the perspective of both of those and hope the conversation we had today was enlightening in regard to this subject of virtual fence. Well, stay with us. Coming back, we're going to be talking deworming. Yeah, it's that time of year. Ready or not, here it comes. So join us in the next segment for that. Here in the cattle business, no doubt from time to time, the conversation has come up maybe with your neighbor across the fence or with your local veterinarian about deworming and parasite control. Well, this past February in San Antonio, Texas, at the Cattle Convention trade show floor, I had the opportunity to sit down and visit with Dr. D.L. Stepp, Senior Professional Services Veterinarian for Beringer Ingelheim, as we talked about the 4 pillars of sustainable deworming. Let's jump into that conversation right now. And Dr. Stepp, thanks for joining us here today on the program.
Yes, thank you for having me.
You bet. We're going to talk about parasite control because in any cattle operation, it definitely is one of the things that kind of hurts our effectiveness and efficiency as cattle. I mean, essentially, if we don't get good parasite control, we can really see it down the road. For myself as a commercial producer, a lot of guys that are raising calves, we want these cattle in the summertime or whenever that's going to really be putting the grass to weight. That conversion to really step up. And it starts with that, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Because internal parasites can have many negative effects, not only on performance related to weight gain, average daily gain in young growing cattle, but body condition score relating to reproductive efficiency. And also one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that internal parasites can negatively affect the animal's ability to respond immunologically to various diseases, viruses, and bacteria, such as shipping fever and pneumonia.
Yeah. Let's talk about the term sustainable deworming.
Yeah.
When I say that, what do you mean by that?
Yes. Sustainable deworming is basically the products we have currently available in different classes of dewormers or medications with different mechanisms of action. We don't have any new products with unique mechanisms for at least probably the next 5 or 10 years, as best as we understand. So sustainability means the products we have available to try to maintain their efficacy and to try to minimize the potential resistance of the parasites in the animal and outside in the environment.
Resistance is a big deal, isn't it? When it comes to when it comes to this and fighting that.
It's a concern that we all should have in dealing with any kind of agricultural enterprise. In other parts of the world, it's much more significant. So what we're trying to do is to try to minimize that potential that could happen here in the United States, and also to be able to try to control them in the animals so that those animals can potentially live up to their genetic potential.
Okay. So when I ask that question, it kind of stems back to what you guys identify as 4 pillars of sustainable deworming, because there's kind of some steps to follow or some things to be thinking about so that doesn't happen and that we do get effective parasite control. Explain those 4 pillars.
Yes, very, very correct. So basically, it's divided into 4 different aspects of sustainable deworming or deworming protocols. And the first one actually stems from diagnostics. And diagnostics, basically, there are 3 different types of tests, and it is to try to determine where a particular operation is at, kind of like a starting point, but then also to measure that is the effectiveness of the deworming program where we would like it to be. So one of the first tests is called a FEC, which is fecal egg count. It's on a per gram of manure or stool, and they just measure a quantity or number of eggs. The second thing is actually to know what species of internal parasite or internal worm we're dealing with. And it will vary a little bit with different classes of cattle, different phases of production, and of course, different ages of the animal. But in order to do that is to go ahead and do what they call a copra culture. And that is a qualified laboratory or people that know how to do this procedure where they actually hatch out the eggs, and that egg will become a first stage larvae. The first stage larvae have unique characteristics that will identify what species they are. And there can be multiple species, and we need to know which one that we need to be concerned with and try to focus that. The third thing is FECRT, and that's fecal egg count reduction test.
Okay.
Now, depending upon the type of dewormer that is being administered to the animal or the group of animals, and it is collecting a fecal sample or stool sample, manure sample. Generally, it's recommended per rectum, and on an individually identified animal on certain group within the population at the time of deworming. Then, depending upon the dewormer class that is being administered, come back so many days after that, somewhere between 14 and 21, 28 days, collect a second sample, again, per rectum, from the same identified animal, and then you do a calculation to get a percent reduction. We'd like to see at least 90% reduction or higher. That would indicate that those dewormers are still fairly efficacious in that population. The second part of the pillars is called combination treatment. And by definition, and most livestock parasitologists are recommending this now, is 2 or more dewormers administered at the same time from different classes of medication that will have different mechanisms of action. And for that one is to maintain or improve efficacy of the products and also decrease the potential resistance. So we have 3 primary classes available in the United States. One are the macrocyclic lactones, abbreviated MCL. The farmers and ranchers may be more familiar with the term indecticide, in which they have a similar mechanism, same mechanism of action. Most of those products available for cattle raisers are either in an injectable or a topical pour-on formulation. The second class is the benzimidazoles, and that's generally a drench, and there are 3 primary active ingredients available. And then the third class is the imidazole thiazoles, and currently that is in an injectable. There is one for small ruminants that is in an oral formulation. Used to be a topical formulation. It's maybe not available in a lot of areas. And that's administer those dewormers to try to minimize that potential resistance, but also to maintain or improve the efficacy. The third particular pillar, and it's a little bit more challenging to understand, and we're trying to get some good research data on this, and that's called refugia. Now, refugia is something that is practiced in other agricultural enterprises, primarily small ruminants, sheep and goats, but also in corn production and cotton production. We know that it works. And that's basically to leave a percent of the population that are untreated, so therefore the medication is not selecting for a potential resistance population. And therefore, when they pass the eggs out in the environment on the pasture, therefore, it will act like a dilutional effect, and it will maintain susceptible internal parasites out in the environment for the animals to pick up. And the fourth one is actually management. And we know that to try to have a good preventive health protocol with our animals, we want proper vaccinations, not only the correct components to try to minimize disease, but at the correct time or the ideal time, optimal time, to try to raise that level of immunity in that herd or population of animals. But also it's managing the environment. such as pasture management. Now, I understand we've all lived through some droughts here recently, and it's hard to maintain a good pasture without having it grazed down. But when we do graze down, pasture's very, very low. There's more opportunity for erosion to happen, but also it's harder on the plants and the root system for those plants to grow back up when we do get favorable conditions for forage growth. But also we do get some noxious plants or weeds that grow up, and generally they're not consumed very palatable to the animals, but also some of those plants, those weeds can be toxic and make those animals sick, or potentially even more negative effects on that. So again, the 4 pillars we kind of look at is 1, diagnostics, 2, combination treatment, 3, refugia, and 4 is a management component.
So on that management component, kind of what goes hand in hand with that is the timing is kind of what you're talking about a little bit, isn't it? And that's really kind of important. And of course, geographically, that could be different depending on from north to south where you are in the country, correct?
Absolutely. And even east to west.
Yeah.
And across from maybe a mountain range to a valley, or a high arid desert to a low marshland. There's many, many different components. So one thing that could be kind of it is a good recommendation, is work with your veterinarian and or your beef cattle specialist, livestock specialist, to try to develop a good deworming protocol.
Okay. So what kind of support services or resources does Boehringer Ingelheim have regarding this?
Yes. And we have several different deworming products and different routes of administration and different active ingredients. So we have sales reps out in the field that are a great resource. We have a veterinary team that helps supports them, and distribution and feed stores and universities and extension personnel. We also have website. You can go to Boehringer Ingelheim and website and look at Deworming Legends, and that will have a lot of good educational information. Plus, you can just go to the website and look at the specific products with their unique characteristics.
Yep. And I know the one website you're talking about was deworminglegends.com. Deworminglegends.com. That's the website, correct?
That is correct. All together.
All together. All
yes,
right.
sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, Dr. Stepp, thanks for joining us here today on the program.
Yes, and thank you for the opportunity.
You bet. Well, don't go too far. Meteorologist Don Day stepping in next with a look at our long-range weather.
Looking for the perfect gift for a gardener or weather enthusiast? Introducing the Tropo, a precision rain gauge that has revolutionized both reliability and convenience. Expertly engineered by meteorologists, the Tropo gauge boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
Our long-range weather today brought to you by Long Range Dewormer. You know, this past week, we moved all of our heifer calves up to the north side of the place, which is where they'll spend most of the summer at. And it got me to thinking, there's really, for all of us that have these replacement heifers or any of these yearling cattle, there's 2 things we want. We want them to grow and to stay healthy, because if they do that, then it leads for us, number 2, is they're going to breed up. They're going to breed up well. And part of that staying healthy is that they're efficient out on pasture with what they've got. You know, and with 150 days of parasite protection in just 1 dose, long-range extended release dewormer can help improve that replacement heifer pregnancy rate and also shorten up those calving intervals. There was a study done where heifers treated with long-range gave birth to about 28% more calves during the first 21 days of calving season than heifers that were just treated with generic ivermectin. And as we all know, earlier calving leads to heavier weaning weights and bigger sale returns on sale day. If you want to find out more, go to the website at longrangedewormer.com. Here's some important information to remember as well. Don't treat within 48 days of slaughter, not for use in female dairy cattle 20 months of age or older, and pregnant women should wear gloves and exercise caution or avoid handling this product. Well, as we turn now and take a look at our long-range weather, joining us as he does each and every week is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, I noticed in one of your podcasts from last week, as you were talking about looking ahead into the coming weekend, which is going to be Easter weekend, really going to start to see some weather taking shape.
Yeah, it really does look like things are finally getting a little more clear. It's been a very muddy water we've been looking at here over the last couple of weeks in terms of really making a forecast past 5 days. And I always am humbled by the fact that with all of our technology, 5 days is where we can be really good. That's 5 days, at 10 days, at 15 days. Sometimes you feel more confident than other times, but boy, the confidence has been really low lately. And a lot of that has to do with the changing seasons. And I think in an earlier podcast not too long ago, we had talked about a stratospheric warming event where the higher levels of the stratosphere expand, and that can kind of really throw a juggernaut into the forecast. And I think that's part of the problem as well. But things are sort of settling down, and we're seeing a pattern evolve during the second half of April that is going to be getting more active for the western United States. Now, that bodes well for the rain-soaked central and south that, there were areas that got 10 to 15 inches of rain over the past 10 days in parts of the central part of the United States. And it would be nice if they would share. And some of that moisture gets spread a little bit further west where it could really be used. And I think the western half of North America starts to get into those better precipitation chances, especially at the end of the month.
Mm-hmm. As we were talking, looking ahead into this coming week, the model's starting to match up a little bit, even in the modeling of when that Pacific North American oscillation is going to head into that negative phase, which indicates that we are seeing that negative phase occurring into this coming weekend, which, again, just signifying and giving more clarity in what this weather's going to look like.
Yeah, and for folks who might be wondering, what the heck is he talking about, a Pacific North American oscillation? It's just another way that scientists try to throw out big words and make it sound more complicated than it is. But across the Pacific Ocean, especially from the west coast of Canada and California, the Pacific Northwest, all the way over to the other side, we're talking Japan, North Korea, the Korean Peninsula over there. How that pattern is configured in terms of where the highs are and where the lows are has a direct impact on North America. Now, you might think, well, that's really far away, but everything is upstream with the weather. So when there's big changes in the Pacific Ocean that go from, let's say, a low pressure dominated pattern like it is now to a high pressure dominated pattern, that ends up reflecting on what happens in North America, especially central and western North America. And when we are in a positive phase, what ends up happening is there's low pressure in the Pacific, which means more often than not high pressure in the West, which is what we've had here over the last week to 10 days. But now we see it going into a negative phase, which means high pressure in the Pacific, low pressure in North America, and especially Western North America. So when we see a signal change like that, that doesn't give us specifics, but it gives us what the trend should be. So the trend should be colder, and the chances of precipitation go up as we see that phase change. And that happens right around the Easter weekend.
Mm-hmm. Are we going to be kind of in it and then out of it, or do we see kind of a shift that's going to take place for a longer period of time than just a one-day sail?
Well, what you'll tend to see is 2-week cycles. So what we'll tend to see is that, so let's say starting around that Easter weekend through that week and the week after, which takes us into the first couple of days of May, we're likely going to see a colder, wetter pattern over the western parts of North America. And that will likely be followed by a week, followed by another 2-week cycle that gets unsettled again.
All right. Well, that gives us an idea. And I think ahead of looking into that Easter weekend, knowing that we're going to see some weather. So appreciate the weather update here today.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. And if you want to catch meteorologist Don Day each and every morning on his video podcast, you can go to his website at dayweather.com. Our long range weather today brought to you by Long Range Dewormer. Hey, thanks again for tuning in and joining us on our program this week. By the way, if you'd like to get a hold of me, you can ask me a question, maybe again send me an idea for a show topic. My email address is justin.workingranch@gmail.com. The Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. Be sure to tune in next week, same time, same place. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.